Please take a moment to find your seat. I don't know, maybe on YouTube they like watching this part. I think I would. Shabbat Shalom. It sounded like, like the old newsreels. Wow, you're all talkative tonight. 1 week off. Sandy was just making sure that everyone was quiet. Please don't forget to put your masks on. We're still in the yellow zone. We'll see what happens if this Omicron shot works. I'm just curious. Well, you're not supposed to drink wine when we have the masking situation. So, how many of you have had your Omicron booster? The new booster. How many of you got it? You got the new one? And a flu shot. Yeah. But unfortunately, it takes a couple of weeks for those Omicron antibodies to build up. So we're following the chart. When it's green, it's optional. When it's yellow or orange, it's like there's like two things going on here: me talking and other people talking to each other. All right, folks, let's get started. It must be an end of summer kind of thing. Just to remind you of the schedule coming up, we will be meeting next week, and then the following weekend is Rosh Hashanah already. I've been working hard on my talks, so I hope you'll enjoy those. We expect to all be in person. At least those of us who want to be in person will be in person. We will be, as we have not been for 3 years, gathering in the family room, the social hall as some of you call it. So we'll be back on our regular format. And maybe with no masks. We'll see what's going on with the virus. I notice it's going down in leaps and bounds every week, and that's before this new shot, so we'll see what happens. I'm not going to tell you what I'm speaking about next week, because I think I'm going to take a little poll, because I had somebody asked for something, and I had already something else in mind, so we'll take a little poll. In any case, it'll be kind of informal, just as we get ready for the holidays. Our readers tonight are Roberta Slade. I have Diana or Jerry, so I don't know which of you, both of you guys. Okay. So Diana and Jerry Lieberman, Michelle Lasdenis, Susie Friedman, Sandy Altman, and Lonnie Fleischer. Lighting our candles in just a moment will be Natan and Beth Fuchs. It is Natan's birthday tonight. Happy birthday, Yom Huledet Sameach. And we'll begin now with the first slide, if you will, Arthur. As these Shabbat candles that we are about to light give light to all who behold them, so may we by our lives give light to all who behold us. As their brightness reminds us of the generations who have kindled light, so may we in our own day be among those who kindle light.
Let us endeavor to find still moments, quiet spaces within to refresh ourselves, moments without ceaseless questions or inner debates, when we meditate only on goodness. Let us endeavor to nurture courage, recalling moments of strength. Let us remember days of fortitude and the power that we found. Let us endeavor to turn to light, to feel the warmth of a loving touch, our faces and fingers outstretched, alive, alive to each other.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I can't.
There are times when we seek things for ourselves and measure failure by what we do not gain. When we gather on Shabbat, we seek not to acquire, but to share. There are times when we exploit nature as if it were a horn of plenty that can never be exhausted. When we gather on Shabbat, we consider our true place on this planet.
There are times when we act as if we cared nothing for the rights of others. When we gather on Shabbat, we remind ourselves that justice is our duty and a better world our goal. Let us embrace this moment, a Shabbat gathering, to unite, to learn, to better ourselves.
Shalom Aleichem, Ohavei Shalom, Shorei Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Rodefei Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. Moachem leShalom, Ohavei Shalom, Zeichem leShalom. Miyom zeh layamim habayim, Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, Ohavei Shalom, Shorei Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Rodefei Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. Moachem leShalom, Ohavei Shalom, Zeichem leShalom.
מיום זה לימים הבאים, שלום עליכם.
May all who walk the paths of righteousness, who work for the good of humanity, and bear the burdens of others, and who give bread to the hungry, who clothe the naked, and take the friendless into their homes. See the work of their hands endure, and may the seed they sow bring abundant harvest.
תקוותי בי, איפה כוחי, כוחי בי, וגם בך, וגם בך, איפה כוחי, כוחי בי, וגם בך, וגם בך. Where is my light? My light is in me. Where is my hope? My hope is in me. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you, and in you. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you, and in you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Let us strive to lead lovingly, compassionate lives with our hearts, with our wisdom, and with our actions. These words which we inscribe in our innermost being, aspiring to practice them day and night, teaching them diligently to our children, through our words and especially through our deeds, so that the next generations may learn to revere and celebrate life.
אני לי מילי, ושאני לעצמי מה אני, ואם לא עכשיו, מתי, מתי. אם אין אני לי מילי, וכשאני לעצמי מה אני, ואם לא עכשיו, מתי, מתי. בכל דור ודור חייב אדם לראות את עצמו כאילו הוא יצא ממצרים. אם אין אני לי מילי, וכשאני לעצמי מה אני, ואם לא עכשיו, מתי, מתי. ואם לא עכשיו, מתי, מתי.
Sing the song of people, joined in understanding and respect, the song of life's wonders and earth protected and cherished, a gift for our children and the generations to come, the song of a land once ravished by war, now quiet and content, her soldiers home to leave no more, the song of a world redeemed, the song of peace.
נעשה שלום, שלום בעולם, נעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל העולם. shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom na'aseh shalom shalom ba'olam na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru
In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, and those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight, our well wishes are extended to these members of our community and to their loved ones, to Joe Gaden, Ruthie Goldman, Max Lark, Deborah Luria, and Rabbi Peter Schweitzer. Excuse me. If there's someone whom you're thinking about whose name you'd like to share, we'll start on this side of the room. Anybody over here? This section? Yes, Michelle. Thank you. Anybody here? Natan? Anybody we miss on this side? Over here, anybody? May all who suffer know that they're not alone, that we are with them. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, a complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies and the renewal of their spirits.
Bekom hakoach betocheinu mekorot habracha michevroteinu. May the source of strength that dwells so deep within us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Shalom. Mekom hakoach betocheinu mekorot habracha michevroteinu. May those in need of healing no refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom all. It's so wonderful to see you all. You can shed tears that they are gone, or you can smile because they've lived. You can close your eyes and pray that they will come back, or you can open your eyes and see all that they have left. Your heart can be empty because you can't see them. Or you could be full of the love that you shared. You can turn your back on tomorrow and live yesterday. Or you can be happy for tomorrow because of yesterday. You can remember them and only that they are gone. Or you can cherish their memory and let it live on. You can cry and close your mind, be empty and turn your back, or you can do what they would want. Smile, open your eyes, love, and go on.
Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. As we recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. Tonight we observe the art sites of these members of our community and their loved ones, of Betty Becker, Sidney Bowman, William Brown, Gertrude Ernst, Edabelle Fieldman, Bernice Gaden, Archie Green, Jerry Hooker, Deborah Hopkins, Phyllis Keller, Cindy Klein, Catherine Kozak, Sam Lieberman, Bernard Lipson, Goad Medier, William Morris, Charlotte Nelson, Fred Nolish, Nathan Prince, Audrey Robinson Klein, Herschel Stewart, Donald Sugarman, Robert Voigt, and Jamie Winchell. If there's someone whom you're thinking about whose name you would add to this list, Sandy. Thank you. Anybody else on this side? Yes, Elaine. Anybody on this side over here? Did we miss anyone at all? We say Yehi Zichram Livracha. May their memories provide a blessing. May we, as we go through this life without them, find a measure of comfort in warm memories that we shared at one time together. If you can do so comfortably, I invite you to now please rise as we recite together our humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. Together, Nit Gadal v'nit Kadash beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us acclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us each in our own way take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. So normally at this time of year we have something informal, especially next week. I usually show a movie, but I had been asked to speak about what was going on in Israel. And I'm going to be honest with you, there's not a lot going on right now. They are in this sort of pre-election dance. And I think a talk like that might be of more value to us after the parties announce who they're going to be. It's not like here where we know Republicans of some kind are going to be running against Democrats. Over there, new parties pop up every day, and nobody knows until maybe 5 or 6 days from now what they're even going to be. So that would be pretty much my talk. Another option is to go with the movie mode, which I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding, where we would look at something in the theme of the holiday. And then finally, somebody asked me if I would speak about England. I have an obsession with England. I'm not an expert on England, but I do have things to say that I think are relevant. So if you have a preference, you can, I don't think we're going to vote. I think you can let me know later, and then I'll give it some thought. But I think the movie is looking more and more, from what I can see, the heads nodding. England? England? You guys want to hear about England? Okay. All right, first I'm going to figure out whether Charles II was a Catholic or not, because I happen to be reading a book right now about the Glorious Revolution. I read books about England all the time, but you know, I'm getting to that age where if I don't write it down, I don't remember it. But I do have some things to say about Her Majesty, those just to give you a sense of my leanings. As you know, I am an unreconstructed Anglophile. I love everything about England and English history, even the parts that are really nasty and horrible. They're the most fun. So I will share with you what I can. But I encourage you to come with your own remembrances, Sandy, as you had, because I think it'd be more fun to talk about to have a discussion about it. And I think that there is some lessons of Jewish civilization that we can learn from the evolution, as I like to point out, of British tradition, which we know that they are filled with, as is our people, and progress and change for modernity, which is something else that if you heard King Charles today speaking about, still not used to saying that, if you heard King Charles speaking today, he did a very good job of talking about Judaism when he talked about tradition and change. All right, I'm going to take my seat here because, as some of you know, I'm doing some of these slide presentations this way, a little bit more of a, somebody called it a fireside chat. It also enables me to not be standing for the whole time, and also assists my eyeballs, which are not getting any younger. Sorry about that. So we're talking about tonight, can you hear me okay? This thing should be picking up pretty well. What we're going to talk about tonight is the first in a series, a sort of occasional series that I want to do on the wider Jewish community. My apologies, you've all now disappeared to me, which is one of my challenges with my eyeballs. I want to start with the most mysterious to a lot of us, which is Orthodox Judaism. Now, a few months ago, Tom Fleischer, sorry? Can you hear now? A few months ago, Tom Fleischer actually called me. I was on my way home from Temple, but I missed the call. He had been driving through, I guess, Huntington Woods, somewhere Oak Park, and it was raining torrentially, and a gentleman was struggling, I suppose, in the rain, walking to synagogue, and he offered him his umbrella. And the man said, "No, I can't take your umbrella because that would be considered erecting a building, erecting a tent on Shabbat." And so, yes, as we secular humanistic Jews and others who are not Orthodox like to do, we had a little giggle about it, but in fact, it's representative of not of that particular law itself, but it reminds us that this is a whole complex of things that works and operates differently for different people. Now, I'm not an Orthodox Jew, but I've lived an Orthodox lifestyle, and I enjoyed it a lot. I didn't believe in God, but that was another problem and a completely separate issue. I happen to know a few, at least modern Orthodox Jews, I know a couple of ultra-Orthodox Jews secretly, who also don't believe in God. But what I got from it was a really strong sense of community, of tradition, of what I later learned was possible to also have in the context of humanistic Judaism, about which at the time I knew very little. And I'm very, very grateful to this movement. But I think that as good citizens of the Jewish world, as people who want to understand it better, I think it behooves us to understand what our different communities are about. And I wanted to start with this one because I think that for most of us, it is absolutely the most mysterious and difficult to comprehend. And I don't know if I'm going to make that much easier tonight. But what I do hope to do is to at least break it down, so that if you walk out with nothing else, will understand that Orthodox Judaism is not a monolith, that there are Orthodox Judaisms, just as there are many other kinds of Judaisms amongst people, secular Judaisms and humanistic and reform and conservative and reconstructionist and renewal, and they have crossovers and blends and sharing and all that kind of stuff. Yes?
Jeff, so building a temple actually is work, then, right?
It's not work, and I'm not going to be able to get into that tonight.
Okay.
I've done that in my classes, and I'm going to do a session of unrolling Judaism on the laws of Shabbat. That's a noon class on Monday. It's coming back on I guess the first Monday or the second Monday after Yom Kippur, and one of our lessons will be how these laws work, because part of the issue is we hear the word work and we think it's labor. But it's not only labor. There's a whole complex way that they arrive at the creative endeavors that you refrain from on Shabbat. And I don't have anything like the time to be able to cover that tonight. So let's first talk about what all these Orthodox Jews from, I guess I'm going to use left and right, because that's what we tend to use for liberal and more and less liberal in our parlance, but it's not always just a matter of political left and right. What do they have in common? Well, they share an adherence to Jewish law. And Jewish law is not what's in the Torah. The Torah is the foundation of the discussion. It's the beginning of a conversation about Jewish law. But Jewish law is essentially what for 2,000 plus years both tradition, meaning people just doing things, and particularly in the last 2,000 years, the rabbis of the Mishnaic and Talmudic eras. If you studied with Natan, you know something about that. What they interpreted out of the Torah, that's why talking about the umbrella tonight is so complex, but what they interpreted out of the Torah and what became a little bit ossified in the medieval era into a very large collection of Jewish law, a codification known as the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch actually means the set table. And that really is what it is. Everything, the forks go in a certain place. If you talk about England, right? If you watch Downton Abbey, they're measuring where the knives and the cups go. Well, that's sort of what happens here. The central belief is that the Torah, the written Torah, as we have it, the 5 books of Moses, is but one Torah. There is an oral interpretation, a tradition of the rabbis, which has now been written down and is in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, which is later hundreds of years of discussions, and in other texts, and they call that the oral Torah. And they have a whole mythos about it. I should tell you, though, that today in the Orthodox world, there are even modern Orthodox Jews who accept the reality that humans wrote the Torah. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about that concept, I strongly urge you to read the magazine that I hope arrived in everybody's mailbox this week, Humanistic Judaism is the Torah for Us. And I wrote something there that explains that a little bit, and there's some others that are even better. In America, the major organizations of orthodoxy are the OU, you see that on all the food that you either buy or don't buy, which is the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations. Founded in 1912, we have Young Israel, and that was meant to be sort of a hip group. They're not quite so hip anymore. And then we have also the much more black-suited, as we'll say, I'll explain some of that in just a second, Agudat Israel of America. And these organizations also have parallels in Israel and other countries throughout the world. So let me first start with this group, and my notes are really up in front of you. What we call ultra-Orthodox, they do not describe as themselves. They don't consider themselves ultra anything. And in fact, the word Orthodox was invented by non-Orthodox Jews to describe them. Once upon a time, and it was only a couple hundred years ago, most Jews were just traditional. First of all, it was easier to be that way. We didn't have all the modern conveniences. And no one had thought about reforming the religion, which, by the way, is where the word Reform Judaism comes from. And conservative Judaism comes from the fact that some of the reformers were more conservative about it. The people who actually are these dark, black-suited folks that we see and identify as ultra-Orthodox are more properly called Haredim. Haredim get their name from the word, really, fear or trembling. And you could use both of them, because this is how they view their relationship with God. It is a kind of an awe that is also fear and trembling. They have an enormous antipathy towards secular culture. They do, in some cases, mix with non-Jews, and even more difficult for them sometimes, with Jews who are not Haredi, when they have the need for commerce, but they avoid it wherever possible. In Israel, they've actually ceased, in many cases, by large numbers, to even work for a living anymore, because the government provides subsidies for them to study all the time. Not, by the way, a traditional Jewish value. In medieval times, in pre-modern times, even early modern times, ultra-Orthodox Jews always worked. In America, they work, because nobody's handing out any money to them. We see them in New York, right? In the Diamond District and all that kind of, right? We see them in the electronics industry, ironically, since they reject so much modernity. They are not crazy about secular education. They frequently don't receive higher education. One of the interesting facts I just read, I knew about this before, but it's holding true even more so, is that the girls are better educated in secular issues than the boys, because they devote less time to Torah, particularly Talmud, which they are forbidden to study according to their interpretation of Jewish law, and they spend much more time, consequently, on English and math and literature and even history, although it can be a kind of a skewed history. There are 700,000, it might be a little bit higher now, in Israel, an average birth rate of 6.5 children per family. There are about 500,000 of them here in the United States. I think that's been growing as well, the same kind. And they are divided into two different kinds of groups. Now, this is something we don't realize when we look at them, because they often look alike to us, at least when they're in sort of New York mode, when they're wearing the 1940s costume of New York Jews, of all people, actually, in the 1940s, right? The hat, etc. The two groups are also very complex. And the reason I'm giving this talk is I want you to understand that when you look at somebody who's of this, to stereotype is very difficult. You should, if you're able, ask questions. But it helps to start out from a point where you know something. The guy that's in the upper picture here is a good example of a sort of a typical Hasidic Jew, a Chassid. Now, I know some of you have studied this with Natan, but I'll talk a little bit about what the difference is between them and other kinds of ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews in a moment. But one of the things that is sort of a hallmark is that they have the Shabbat fur hat, right? These things can cost, by the way, thousands and thousands of dollars. They have the very excessive side curls, some of them going very, very long down. So that's one marker of theirs. You'll often see them on Shabbat, not only in the shtreimels, the headgear here, but also in white stockings, in buckle shoes or shoes with no laces. Much of this was taken from the Polish nobility of the 17th and 16th century. And as you'll hear in a moment, it's because Hasidim were kind of out there. They were not, as we have today, insular and foreign to all other Jews and to everyone else, of course. They were much more avant-garde in some ways. I'll talk about that in a minute. The other large group of Haredim are known variously, and it's all one group of people, as misnagdim. That's a little bit less heard today, but it means the opponents. Who did they oppose? The Hasidim. The Hasidim were one of the first revolutionary groups in Eastern Europe. They are also sometimes called Litvish because the area of their strength was Vilnius today, Lithuania, that part, sort of the northern area of the Pale of Settlement. And what I hear mostly from Orthodox Jews, and you know I know a few, is yeshivish. What basically divides them is, on one hand, Hasidim have a very a mystical outlook on life. And I'll get into that a little bit in a moment. And the yeshivish are not focused on this mystical, Kabbalistic point of view. They really come from a more, what we call in Jewish academic circles, pilpulistic, but you've heard the word pilpul because it's entered the English language, meaning a kind of a very, very exacting reading of the Talmud, a very academic kind of approach as they understand academics, not as we do. So where do the Hasidim come from? They originated, as I said, in Eastern Europe, and actually in today's Belarus and Ukraine, in the 18th century. So in a sense, not that old, really. This was around the time that the founding fathers were running around, and George II and George III were on the thrones in England. They were founded by a man named Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov. His real name was Israel ben Eliezer, Israel son of Eliezer. But the Baal Shem Tov means the master of the good name. Whose good name is it? God's good name. As you know, one of the names for God, one of the substitute names for God is Hashem, right? They, in this sort of avant-garde way that I'm talking about, they sought to reintroduce joy into the performance of the mitzvahs and into prayer. And they did popularize this Sephardic-based, primarily, mysticism that had come out of 15th, 16th century Spain, and they tried to make Judaism about joy, about love. They met in forests. They did not meet in synagogues. They were not organized. Their rebbes, who began to take on a mystical quality, especially the descendants, both spiritual and real, of Yisrael ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, they were often known for their ability to tell stories and teach lessons and captivate audiences. And people would lose children almost like in a cult out in the forest, meaning they were now following the Baal Shem Tov and his descendants. They were, as I mentioned, opposed by the establishment. These misnogdim, in modern Hebrew, mitnaged, means to oppose somebody, to be in opposition, well, in ancient Hebrew too. This Lithuanian group that was very academically based. The Baal Shem Tov wanted religious scholarship, wanted rigorous scholarship to combine with emotional mitzvah observant. He was rebellious, as I mentioned, faced this fierce opposition. I like this picture. I'm sorry it's so small. I should have made it bigger. I had more room, but it's a good example. Has anybody ever been to a real, not Chabad, although Chabad counts, but to a real Hasidic, a Farbrengen or a Shabbos or something like that, where they're dancing all night long? Women probably would not have experienced this, but the men might have. And the joy and the chanting, I mean, they go late into the night. On a Shabbat, they can go well into midnight. Their Rebbe, whoever they're organized around, is usually waiting for them, and then he eats his dinner later, and they eat his scraps. It's called the Rebbe's Tish. Over time, they branched out into all these groups, and both in Hebrew and in English today, they're called courts, like the Court of St. James, I guess you could say, where they're organized these Rebbes. There are about 30 large groups. There's 200 smaller groups. These could be as few as 5, 10, 15, 20 families, if that. And there's been a lot of charismatic leaders who inherited his mantle. Now, notable among these was this fella here, named Nachman of Bratslav, or Breslav. The Hasidim who descend from him are one of the largest Hasidic groups. They may actually be the largest Hasidic group now, and they have no living Rebbe. They have no living Rebbe. Ever since Reb Nachman died, they've sort of been on their own. Doesn't mean they don't have a leader, but they don't have a mystical leader in whom they invest sort of a magical touch. Reb Nachman is respected by Jews throughout the world. Conservative Jewish rabbis, Reform rabbis, have written books about Reb Nachman, have written collections of his tales and his legends that he made up and that he taught. This is the level of popularity that he has. He's revered by all Hasidim, whether they are members of the Bratslavers, which is the name of his Hasidic group's court, or not. Every year at Rosh Hashanah time, they head to Uman, which is in Ukraine, for a big. I don't know how they just skip out on their families, but they do. They skip out on their families, and thousands of them gather them. This is where what you're looking at here in this other picture. This is his burial site. This year they are being encouraged not to go. And I am hopeful that they will not go, because it could very well become a massacre. It's very much in the war zone. Another great Hasidic Rebbe was Menachem Mendel of Kotsk from Poland. He of the Ger Hasidim, also enormous today. And this one fella, who I mentioned to you, you'll know a little bit about, a fellow named Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Now, Shneur Zalman of Liadi had a kind of an intellectual approach to Hasidism. Now we're moving into the 19th century, right? And into the late 19th century. He had a more of an intellectual approach. And he named his movement not after the town he was from, which was the most customary thing. It was either the rabbi or the town. Even the Bratslavers are named after Bratslav and not Reb Nachman. But he named his movement after 3 Hebrew words from which he created an acronym. Chochmah, meaning wisdom, Bina, meaning wisdom, and Da'at, meaning wisdom and knowledge. There are three shades in Hebrew of wisdom and knowledge. And there are mystical explanations for their differences that you can find in all kinds of Zoharic charts. But together they spell Chabad, Chabad. And because they were from the town of Lubavitch, they became known as the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidim. And they were normal Hasidim for a little while. They became a little bit different, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in a moment. But as I mentioned, there are as many as 1 million Hasidic Jews worldwide. It may be slightly more right now. And in Israel, you'll find that the largest are the Ger, the Chabad Lubavitch. I mentioned the Belts. I didn't mention the Belts, but Satmar, Toldos Aharon. In the United States, Satmar is by far and away the largest. They're all pretty much centered in New York, in various parts of New York. They were devastated during the Holocaust. And the reason that they have grown so large here is because so many of the few who survived came here. Some of you might have seen the show, the movie, or the miniseries Unorthodox. And that comes up in there, that fear of being destroyed again, and that mitzvah, that commandment that they view as one of the most important, to be fruitful and multiply. It took a long time to reconstitute themselves here in the United States, and they were not well received. They were not well received. They were very foreign. Orthodoxy, by and large, was not a major movement in the United States until after the war. But Hasidim, they were particularly foreign. I always recommend the short story by Philip Roth called Eli the Fanatic. You might want to take a look at that. It's a good read, and it gives you a little bit of an idea of how they were received. The fastest growing in America are located in Rockland County, New York, the whole western Hudson Valley area, Monsey, Monroe, New Skver, as they call it. Kiryas Joel, it's an incorporated town. You might have remembered meeting Shulam Dean, the former ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jew. He was a Satmar Jew. He came here and spoke to us of why he left. Today, I guess we would call him a secular humanistic Jew. They're humanists. There are groups in many other cities too, and there's quite a few in Israel, as I mentioned. Primarily focused, concentrated in Jerusalem, Bnei Brak, which, if you've ever driven through there, you might not realize it except by looking at the people, because it's a big city suburb of Tel Aviv, is what it is. The Satmar are an interesting story in of themselves, and because they're so large here, I'll just mention very quickly, this rabbi here from the cover of Mishpacha magazine, which is in every grocery store in my children's neighborhood, Rav Aaron Teitelbaum, when he is one of two heirs to his father, I believe it was his father, Moshe Teitelbaum's empire of Satmar Hasidism. Rav Aaron, he took his camp to Kiryas Joel, and Reb Zalman is in Brooklyn and in Skver, New Square, in Rockland County. They are very famous as anti-Zionists. And when you see Hasidic Jews at Palestinian protests and so forth, condemning Israel, condemning the existence of Israel, this is why. I'll talk about their Zionism in a moment. If you've ever met a Hasidic Jew, the chances are very great that the one you met was a Chabad Lubavitch, or as we simply call them, Chabadniks. They were founded, as we mentioned, in 1775 by Shneur Zalman, but they became our neighbors, and neighbors to every Jew, and very, very many non-Jews, on every block on the planet, every mountaintop and every deep valley, every river, lake, and island, because of their Menachem Schneerson, who was the last living Rebbe, his decision to reach out to Jews all over the world. He is the first truly proselytizing rabbi in a very, very, very long time of not proselytizing, but his proselytization was solely directed at Jews. My first encounter with them, many of our first encounters with them, were in the Chabad houses at universities. I remember walking up the mall in the University of Texas where I went as an undergraduate, and somebody accosting me, asking me if I was Jewish. That was the only thing he wanted to know. Later I realized I'd also met them at my middle school. I didn't know it was them because they had these mitzvah tanks, these mobile homes where they would hand out Shabbat candles and all kinds of things. And they do that too. What you're looking at here is just a small sample of these emissaries, these shluchim, most of whom grow up in an insular Chabad Lubavitch environment. And because, I suppose, like the Mormon sort of incentive, feel this need to go out into the world and convert the Jews, they go out into the world and they convert the Jews. They're given a small stipend. They find a house, they find donors, they have 1 year, and then they're cut loose. You either sink or swim, and almost all of them swim because they are that committed. My daughter's wedding is going to be conducted by my future son-in-law's Chabad rabbi. Now, he grew up modern Orthodox, but he became involved with the Chabad, and that's his Rebbe now. That's his rabbi. One of the things, though, about Chabad Lubavitch is that there's always going to be an inevitable problem when you leave the nest. Because when you leave the nest doesn't come with you. When you go out into the world is there. And this has had a very interesting impact on the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidism. Already they had a few strange customs. They, for instance, do not wear the shtreimels. They do not wear the white stockings. They wear the black suits primarily that are customary among many Orthodox rabbis, including some modern Orthodox rabbis. They sometimes even wear blue blazers with patches on the elbows, and even jeans. They often cannot send their children, especially when they're young, away to Jewish schools. My JCC was filled with Chabad Lubavitch children. Why? Because we had 2 Chabad houses, and they had nowhere else to go. They did not want to send their children to the Reform or Conservative congregations for preschool, so instead they sent them to the JCC. Not that we were any better, but we were more accommodating. Once you begin to interface with the secular world, there are things that are going to begin to seep over. This has created an enormous stress and set of tensions between them and other Hasidim. And even sometimes, and I've experienced this myself, it's not spoken about, but between the ones who live in the verflung, that's not Yiddish, it's English, the verflung communities, and the ones who still live in Brooklyn, who are very much part of the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox world. All right, I want to move on a little bit because I don't want to keep you here all night, and I got a lot to say about some others. We talked about the Yeshivish, the Litvish, Misnagdim, a whole different kind of group, even though they're wearing the black outfits. They are indistinguishable from Chabad Lubavitch, since Chabad Lubavitch got rid of the clothing that's distinct, but you can always tell Chabad Lubavitch by their Hanukkah menorahs. They're the ones that go with the straight lines, right? Had to do with a ruling by their Rebbe. They don't have a grand Rebbe. They don't have a mystical approach. They hated these guys from the beginning, but today they have much in common, although they continue to be organized around yeshivas, which is very different than being organized around a Rebbe who you revere, or a Rebbe's ghost, in the case of Chabad, in the case of Bratslav, whom you revere. They, in Israel and America, but it's less important here, joined together in this Agudat Yisrael, the Aguda, it's called. In Israel, it's important because they run as a political party, and they have to sort of rotate the seats and who gets to be in charge and this and that, and they're in the middle of a little war right now with each other because the Yeshivish want to make certain kinds of concessions to receive government money that the Hasidim do not want to take. It's very complicated. The other thing about the Misnagdim, the Yeshivish, is that they tend to be Zionists. I should mention, too, the Chabadniks tend to be Zionists, It was another outcome of going out into the world. How are you going to get all these rich Jews to build you a beautiful place in West Bloomfield and be condemning Israel at the same time while they're heading off to their AIPAC meetings? You're not getting that money. And slowly but surely they started to. There's one last group of Haredim. These are the artificial Haredim. They were made in a laboratory. These are the Sephardic Haredim. The reason we have Sephardic Haredim is because of racism and hatred in Israel. Because the religious Sephardic Jews, they were sort of like, I compare them to Catholics today in many cases, right? You know, that they're not going to go join the Anglican, the Episcopalian Church or the Presbyterian, but they're going to go to the Catholic Church. But, you know, they want an abortion, they're going to get an abortion. They want to use birth control, they're going to use birth control. They do what they want to do. This is how the Sephardic Jews were from Northern Africa, from many places in the Arab world. There was only one Jewish religion. We would call it Orthodoxy. They didn't even have a name for it. There was no Reformation. There was no Reform, no Conservative. That was all European shtick. When they started coming to Israel, for reasons that we don't have time to go into tonight, the religious among them were funneled in to a series of, and with a quota system, of Ashkenazic Haredi areas, particularly the yeshivish. And they, in order to be accepted, they put on the black jackets. They used to wear beautiful, colorful outfits and, you know, what do you call those things that they wear in the Middle East? The turbans, but I was thinking about the round ones, the ones that look more like a donut. Not streimels, that's Yiddish. And they would go into these places, and in order to be accepted, because they were already looked down upon as being from lesser Jews in Iraq or Tunisia or wherever that place they were from as they were thought of, they wound up putting on the black coats, and once they gained some power, establishing their own yeshivas, and ultimately, and it was late, it was the 1970s and 80s, founding a political party. The guy there on the lower right, I once talked about him about 9 years ago when he died, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was a chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, and you can see the kind of thing they wore. There it is right there. Today, Aryeh Deri, who's a former convict, he's the head of their party, and they're a pretty popular party, and Sephardic Jews who are not Orthodox at all have in the past, I don't know how prevalent it is now, but have in the past given them a lot of seats in the Knesset out of Sephardic pride. Because no demands were made on them. They didn't know, you have to be religious, you have to join us. That never worked for the Aguda. If you're from a European background and you see someone with that outfit coming, you know exactly what they want from you, except Chabad. They don't tend, most of the Hasidim, as I mentioned, to be Zionist, and the reason, if I haven't told you, is because how can you participate in this secular enterprise of building a secular state before the Messiah has come? And because Zionism began as a secular enterprise, even though it was joined at some point by some religious Jews, and today has many religious adherents, these folks, and there's one from Satmar, the No to Israel flag, they had no interest. Now others are not anti-Israel or not anti-Zionist, but they're accommodationist. They wanted power, they wanted a seat at the table, and that's why they established the Aguda. The Satmar have very few people in Israel. They'll vote here, but they will not vote there, the ones who exist. If you've heard of the Neturei Karta, that's one of their groups. After 1948, as I mentioned, some of these groups became pragmatic. The Aguda, there's another one called Degel HaTorah, I think that one's gone now. And they have a political party. This is the Moshe Gafni, who was one of the recent leaders. And Chabad, just to return to them, they became, as I mentioned, pretty darn Zionist. They established a village in Israel called Kfar Chabad. But the most hysterical thing that they did was they built an exact replica down to the 110 outlets, because you know Israel's on the 220 like Europe, down to the 110 outlets of 777 Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn. And you can see there's the original on the top up in Brooklyn, and there is the replica to the brick Each brick imported from the United States that was built there. That's the commitment they have now made to Zionism in Israel. Haredim, again, with the exception of Chabad Lubavitch, which doesn't play this game quite so viciously, but Haredim, and particularly Hasidisha, but also many of the Litvish, have an extremist point of view when it comes to women and their separation. Almost a complete erasure of women from all public spaces. Here's a baby doll in a supplement in one of their newspapers, blurred out, because it's a girl doll. My favorite is this Pampers commercial where, I mean, my little granddaughter was just doing this pose, downward facing dog. It's yoga. We were doing yoga. She was doing it with Arthur. But had she been doing it in one of their homes, I suppose they would have taken a picture and flipped it so it didn't look like that. I don't know what she's holding on to in this right side here. Maybe her kepi, thinking, oh my God, I got to grow up around these people. Look at what they did to this famous picture. Oh, Arthur, next one. I'm sorry. You've been doing really good. I haven't even said next once. I forgot that he was doing that because I have the same one on my screen. This famous picture here from the Warsaw Ghetto featured a woman that was also being arrested by the Nazis. Look what they did in a story about her there. Here's a defacement in the upper right of a woman who was running for an office, Jerusalem. And here are examples of men here, women there. Separate entrances at medical clinics, separate entrances at post offices, separate sidewalks. That's the degree of their misogyny. One of my least favorite Jewish traditions, probably the worst of all, now there's a few contenders for that, is what's known as the Rebbe's Tanz. The Rebbe's Tanz is when the Rebbe dances with the bride at her wedding. Note how she is invisible, and the dance is really her being led around like a piece of cattle by the Rebbe, who is the one who is dancing, while men are in the bleachers watching this. I will tell you that I learned about this very late in my Jewish life. All right, let's switch to modern Orthodoxy. Now, we're going to start with modern/Zionist Orthodoxy. They're not identical. There are modern Orthodox Jews and there are modern Zionist Orthodox Jews. But for the sake of expediency, and because there's a lot of overlap, as I said in the slide, we're going to assume they're basically the same. 12% of Israelis are modern Orthodox. And the development of modern Orthodox, well, it's separate from the development of Zionism, and modern Orthodox Zionism is on a parallel track. Because both modern Orthodoxy and its Zionist version, which, as I said, mostly overlap, come from the interface and the acceptance of the secular world, unlike fighting back against it. The next slide. Modern Orthodoxy was established in the 18th century, into the 19th century, really, by Orthodox, and again, that word didn't exist, but traditional rabbis who were in conversation with Reformation-minded Jews, of whom there were radical reformers, conservative reformers, the name that they are now stuck with, because they're not a conservative movement, and there were the modern. Their underlying philosophy was trying to come to an accommodation between Torah, which that should be clear to you, but all of Torah, all of Jewish life, and Madà, science, as we translate it today. They wanted to synthesize these Jewish values and the observance of the Jewish law with acceptance into the modern world, participation in the modern world. For that reason, they are today the group of Jews, of Orthodox Jews that we see, who are the most integrated into our lives. How many of you have modern Orthodox family? Libby, you do. That's it? That's all that have it? All right, well, as you know, I do. How many? Quite a few now. 6 very precious people in my life are modern Orthodox. Israel is also very important to them for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, But particularly since 1967, there's been a theology of Zionism that goes with some of them, and it's caused a split among them as well. There are about 800,000, I would say closer to 1 million today in Israel, 250,000, maybe closer to 300,000 in the United States. They are not growing in the United States. They are not growing. They are also growing slower than you would think in Israel, but the biggest shrinkage is actually coming, it's not shrinkage, it's slower growth, from the Haredim. They have an enormous dropout rate, and they do not drop down to modern Orthodoxy. I've talked to them before. Why don't you? They said, well, listen, once we stopped believing in God and took off the black outfits, we didn't want to start putting on, the little kippah and the more modern taluses and saying all the same words again. Some, however, do go to modern Orthodox. Their relations with other Jews are really important to them. They want to be part of the larger Jewish community. But there is a scale, and it's more of a color scale, where yeshivish sometimes bleed into modern Orthodox. So my daughters grew up, for instance, with girls, they went to all-girls schools, who had televisions and went to movies and were fans of Taylor Swift. That was their generation. And they knew girls in some of their schools, particularly middle school, who had no TVs or had only a video player that they could watch Uncle Menchie on, the popular Uncle Moishi on, and that kind of thing. And certainly didn't know about movies and did not know about Taylor Swift. And there was a gradation there. Later, both of my girls went, actually my younger daughter went to a modern Orthodox school. They are the Orthodox Jews that you will see at the Jewish federations. They are the Orthodox Jews you'll see working for JCCs, Jewish educational places, schools that are community day schools as opposed to solely Orthodox day schools. It matters where they get their funding from, etc. My daughter, who's married with my two grandchildren, she sends my grandson to a modern Orthodox synagogue that her house happens to back up on. Not that they were looking for that, but it's nice. And it's like their school is a community day school, meaning it receives a lot of its funding from the Federation. And so while it follows an Orthodox template, many of the students who go there are not Orthodox. They try as best they can to navigate the modern world. They tend to send their children to college very strongly. They struggle with progressivism. Because I've been associated with that world, I've met many queer Jews who are modern Orthodox. At first, it was sort of an aberration, and today it's becoming threatening to the Orthodox Jewish world. Sadly, many of them have been pulled rightward politically. Some 75 to 80% are Trumpists. It absolutely has to do with abortion and things like that, on which they do tend to be more right-wing, but also Israel. They began, and I'm going to go through this really quickly, with the idea that you could be Orthodox. And this fellow here, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who's, if you've ever went in your youth to any synagogue, you had his Chumash, his book of Torah readings. It was Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch's. It was the standard in America for years and years, translated from German. We all had it. Probably many of you have it at home. And later the Reform and Conservative came out with their own too. But his saying, and you can see, he dressed like a clergyman. You see those what? That's a Lutheran clergyman outfit. He said you can be a Jew in the home and a mensch, a man, a human, a regular person, in the street. This was back when it was easier to keep your head covered too, because everybody wore hats. Now the original Zionists I spoke about were secular. The Reform rejected them because they didn't like the idea of Jewish nationalism, the traditional for reasons we've talked about. But along in the 1920s comes this fella, Avraham Yitzchak Kook. It's Kook, really, C-O-O-K. I don't always spell it with a K. And he made this very weird decision for an Orthodox Jew to cooperate with the secular Jews. He says, they don't know it, because they're heretics, but they have a divine spark in them. And that divine spark is why they're building the land. That's why they're building a country. He said, if we work with them, it's going to be good for us. And what he was really doing was being pragmatic. because this was the time when serious suffering was beginning to arise. I once read an essay by him supporting evolution. That's how advanced he was. Unfortunately, after 1967, many of these so-called modern Orthodox Jews, who turned out maybe not to be so modern, also became extremist nationalists. And you may know that Israel is a country significantly to the right of ours in its Jewish community, which is almost everybody there. It is not a liberal, democratic, small, capital D kind of place. It is a very right-wing nationalist place with a lot of ideas about Jewish supremacy and a lot of assumptions among religious and non-religious Jews that God selected the Jews, that the whole world wants to destroy us, and that the victories such as the retaking of Jerusalem in 1967 with the West Bank were gifts of God. And in fact, I remember one day looking at my daughter's history book that she brought. This was her secular history or Jewish history book. And the entire introduction was about how God controls Jewish history, modern Orthodoxy. And the evidence of this was the 1967 Six-Day War. How else could you explain the retaking of Jerusalem? And this has produced an enormous amount of problems. A group called Gush Emunim, the Block of the Faithful, started the settler movement. Now, not all settlers are Orthodox, not by a long shot. One of my dearest friends, some of you met her, she's been here a few times, Rayut, technically comes from a settler family because they live a couple of blocks over the Green Line in a secular settlement. But the ones who drive it ideologically are, quote unquote, modern Orthodox Jews. Today, they are becoming more powerful. And this is right out of today's headline. This is actually a picture from Haaretz, I think this week or recently, of these two men surrounding Netanyahu. These guys are the heads of a party called, on the left, on your right, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Jewish Power Party, a Kahanist organization. Bezalel Smotrich from the Religious Zionism Party. They are racists. They are extremists in every way. They are, sorry to use this word again, unreconstructed racists, Jewish supremacists, and Netanyahu is trying to bring them together in one party because this is one thing upon which he's dependent in order to form a coalition. That's why I say it's a little bit premature to talk about what's going on there because this is all happening right now. The other is the split in the ultra-Orthodox Jews. He needs them united because there is a threshold of votes you must cross to get any seats. There's been a rightward drift of modern Orthodox Jews in many ways throughout Israel, even in America. But there's also been a reaction to it, which I'm very happy and optimistic about. Modern Orthodox is increasingly rejecting Mad'a, the science, the next one, drifting more and more towards Haredization, longer beards, bigger yarmulkes, not necessarily the black suits, but all of the stricter things that go with it, and a kind of anti-statism, by the way, because they're not supporting the secular state, all of them. They have this idea that they're either going to transform it into what will essentially be a fascist state, or they're going to get rid of it and create a complete theological state. For those of you who heard my talk on Christian nationalism, this is Jewish nationalism at its worst, and it's growing very solidly in popularity. It now extends to a lot of quarters of the Likud party, founded as a secular party, and of course these others that we've talked about as well. All right, let's go on to the progressive one, Arthur. We're going to skip this slide just because it's getting late. Now, there are progressive elements. Two of my heroes of Orthodox Judaism, and I had the pleasure of meeting both of them in my younger years, are in this top picture here. Rabbi Yitzchak Greenberg from New York, his wife Blue Greenberg, who was one of the first Orthodox women to call herself a feminist and wrote a wonderful book about it. The one in the bottom there is a man named Rabbi Avi Weiss. He's from Riverdale. He tends to be a little bit right-wing on Israel, although I don't know where he stands these days. But he founded a wonderful yeshiva called Chovevei Torah, the Lovers of Torah. And he invented, to go along with it, a term that they since dropped, but I like it, called open orthodoxy, meaning open to the world. He also established a yeshiva for women to ordain them as religious leaders. And this is happening right now. Now, they have different words for it. The name of the yeshiva is Maharat, which is an acronym. It's an acronym for a religious and spiritual leader, but they function as clergy. Now, that doesn't mean they're leading men's services, although most Orthodox rabbis don't lead the services anyway, nor that they're accounted in minions or that any of those other things are happening, but they can teach and they can advocate. And after all, I also don't lead minions, and I also don't have legal rights to sign documents in Jewish law, because I don't believe in Jewish law. Now they do. They lead women's minions. They were the ones who established the women of the wall. We tend to associate this today. Whenever we read a headline in the foreword or in Haaretz, which is a good thing you should be reading, we hear about the women of the wall. They make the New York Times frequently, and we assume they're Reformed, they're Orthodox, and many are today. But I knew the founder. My friend Shulamit Dershowitz, one of the founders, whose son, by the way, is a great biblical scholar living in Germany, and whose husband is a computer scientist par excellence. Modern Orthodox people, they were the ones who founded these women's minions. This Yeshivat Maharat, this one was out of order. But here you see, confirming Orthodox women as halakhic and spiritual leaders, while they are given the degree of Maharat, I've noticed more and more are calling themselves Rabbah, which is a feminized word in Hebrew of rabbi. And they have organizations. So that's the book there, the one that sort of was groundbreaking on women in Judaism by Blue Greenberg, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, and an organization that I donate to called Uri Letzedek, about social justice. Wake up, it says. Wake up to justice. This is a social justice organization that is very similar to anything we would do. And they are out there fighting for immigrants, fighting for racial equality, fighting for reproductive rights, which they view very much more like conservative Jews do here on this side of that, and on and on and on and on. LGBTQ rights, which they are pushing up against certain organizations. The next one, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I did want to go to this slide for a minute, because after Avi Weiss, the leader of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah was this fellow. Anybody know who this is? I know he's a little grayer now. Some of you live near him. It's Rabbi Asher Lopatin. Rabbi Asher Lopatin, who recently appeared on a panel discussion sponsored by Jews for a Secular Democracy, an initiative of the Society of Humanistic Judaism, and who has 3 pictures in this month's Humanistic Judaism magazine, is the head of our JCRC here in Detroit. He moved here for personal reasons. His wife is from Detroit. And he created a scandal when at the first dinner, when he was president, Rosh Yeshiva they call it, the head of the yeshiva, he invited conservative and reform rabbis to come and celebrate and speak at that dinner. It was really something. This is a man to be celebrated. We are very fortunate to have him here in this community. He is a true Jewish pluralist. Not everybody is. And unfortunately, one of the leading institutions of Orthodox Judaism today, Yeshiva University, which has the motto Torah Umada, Torah and Science, has been pushing against much of this modernism. They separated out their medical school, they separated out the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law, and have lately become very reactionary. Today, Justice Sotomayor put a stay on a New York state court that had ruled that they could not ban, because they receive federal funding, their LGBTQ group. It's been around there for 15 years. And you may say, oh, Sotomayor, why would she do that? Well, she has to do it because we know of the recent court decisions. This is that business I was telling you about, of the Establishment Clause versus the Free Exercise Clause. If you didn't see my talk on Christian nationalism, go watch it. It's got over 200 views now on Facebook. So some conclusions. Well, number one, again, I said I hope that if you walked away with anything, it would be an understanding that there is pluralism and a great deal of diversity in the Orthodox Jewish community. That when I talk about my children who are members of the Orthodox community, it is not the same thing as another Jew talking about theirs. You have to know more about the people. There are many values they share with us. There are many values that we do not share. There is an enormous overlap. Not every Orthodox woman is walking around with a sheitel, a head covering, and a long skirt. Some of them, I'm not naming names, but some I know actually wear just their hair and blue jeans and go to modern schools and watch television. And yes, listen to Taylor Swift, who I've seen in concert twice. And I think it's important for us as secular humanistic Jews who care about Jewish peoplehood. After all, what are we doing here if we don't? Who care about Jewish culture, to remember that these people are part of our family too. So I thank you for your patience tonight, listening to me talk about this. It is a favorite topic of mine. And I guess next week we're going to have an informal conversation in which I am going to talk about something that nobody usually can ever get me to shut up about, which is my love of England, yes. So anyway, we're going to conclude. What is our concluding song? This beautiful song, Hine Matov, a version of which.
Hine Matov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine matov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Behold how good it is when people dwell together, living as one people, hand in hand. What keeps us safe and strong is that we have each other, one human family across the land. Hine matov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine matov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad.
I'm going to thank Arthur for running the show, apparently telepathically. Thank you. David, who handles our streaming. And of course, our wonderful Joseph Palazzolo. And all of you, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.